Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here so late in the afternoon. Over the last 15 years or so, I've had the dubious privilege and opportunity to look deeply into the inner workings of maybe up to 100 warehouses all around the world. Here at home in Ireland, in Britain, Europe, Middle East, Asia and the Americas. 60 to 70% of those warehouses have been in manufacturing industry, in sectors such as pharmaceuticals, medical devices, food, beverage and industrial equipment. So while all warehouse facilities that support manufacturing operations have fundamentally the same processes, one of the things that's always struck me about the different places I visited on my travels is the divergence of standards, of practices, performance among these different facilities. There's actually a very large gap between best practice, best-in-class operations, and the also-rans. The root of this divergence, in my opinion, is that until relatively recently, in most manufacturing businesses, the warehouse has been considered, whether explicitly or more likely implicitly, as a sort of Cinderella department in the overall scheme of things. And this is a theme I'll return to presently. Firstly, I'd just like to give you an overview of what I will be talking to you about today. In the first part of my talk, we'll take a look at the history and the evolution of warehousing in manufacturing industry and where warehousing fits into the overall wider strategic picture in the modern supply chain. Then we'll dive into a more tactical level in the second part of the presentation to touch on 2 or 3 specific topics related to day-to-day operations and discuss how the best-in-class manufacturing businesses are improving their effectiveness in these areas to better support the wider business goals. And then finally, we'll come back up to the higher level in the last part and take a quick look at some of the more strategic trends that are already evident out there and that are changing the face of warehousing in manufacturing industry today and into the future. I mentioned in my introduction the idea of warehousing having played the role of the Cinderella department in manufacturing businesses. What I mean by this is that the warehousing function, in comparison to others such as production, sales, marketing, R&D and so on, has received proportionately less attention, focus and investment over the years when compared to other functions. The reasons for this, on the one hand, are historical stroke cultural, and on the other hand, they're associated with the actual physical and environmental nature of warehousing itself. In the historical and cultural sense, warehousing has rarely been considered a core competence by most manufacturing businesses. If you look back into the history of your own companies, you'll probably find that in the early days, the company coalesced around a product idea or maybe a production capability or maybe even an ability to market and sell. And consequently, the driving force and the center of gravity of the business will tend to lie in one or other of these areas. As a result then, logistics and warehousing as an element of logistics has often been viewed traditionally as a necessary evil, something that can't be avoided totally, but not a theme that has generated any kind of enthusiasm or energy among the movers and shakers within the early business. The business now may be decades old, but in many instances the Cinderella legacy endures. The other aspect of this phenomenon is the actual physical environment of the warehouse itself and the operations that take place there. Warehouse operations are typified by long cycle times, work that takes place over long distances, often at great height with heavy equipment such as stackers, fork trucks, order pickers, and where integrated digital technology is a fairly recent phenomenon. So because of these characteristics, there's always been a real difficulty in monitoring, managing, and the control of warehouse operations. And finally, relatively speaking, in comparison to the factory floor, the labs, or the staff offices in your business, the warehouse is a harsh, or at least a harsher environment filled with boxes, pallets, steel racking, forklift trucks, docks, inverters, and so on. So executives from the site leadership teams in many companies, they rarely adventure into the deep recesses of the plant where warehouse operations take place. And I exaggerate only slightly here to make the point, a point that in essence I believe is quite true. However, things are changing now quickly. Over the last 10 to 15 years or so, in response to globalization, which is powered by innovations in transport technology, in containerization, air freight, financial deregulation, and information and communications technology, the idea of managing a global supply chain, or probably more accurately, a global supply network, has come to the fore, and this is having a major impact on the perceived role of the warehouse in manufacturing businesses. With each year that passes, the warehouse is becoming an ever more crucial link in the theory and practice of supply chain management, with worldwide operations carrying on interrelated activities, whether between sister plants or between supplier and customers up and down the supply chain. Nowadays, a poorly designed and operated warehouse can play havoc with planning, production, quality, and customer service, whereas a well-designed and operated warehouse can add significant value to your business and deliver real competitive advantage. At this point then, I'd like to take a look at a number of tactical day-to-day aspects of warehouse operations, before then returning back up to the higher level and taking a brief look at some future trends. This is just to give you a flavour of what I'm seeing among best-in-class manufacturing companies around the world as they address challenges in these areas. So given the limited time we have today, I'll just touch on three different topics. The first is warehouse layout and storage equipment. The second is stock deployment within the warehouse. And the third is the development of standards and performance management in warehouse operations. In terms of layouts and storage equipment, just like all other aspects of business, the warehouse is a place where processes are taking place. Things like receipt, put away, retrieval, picking, shipping, and so on. These processes involve the movement of people, machines, stock, provision of information, and the interaction between human beings and digital information systems. So the efficiency and the effectiveness of these processes is going to be very fundamentally impacted by the physical layout of the warehouse itself. And there are two particular areas of concern here. The first is the provision within warehouse facilities of sufficient open spaces to allow the staging and the flow of goods through the various stages of the processes. And the second is the specification of the right storage equipment to best match the true physical and dynamic throughput characteristics of the stock profile. So in the best facilities, you see clearly thought through layouts that have been developed with the active participation of multiple stakeholders, including facilities engineering, warehouse operations, manufacturing operations, quality and safety. And these give rise then to layouts that can minimize travel distances, avoid double backing, dead legging, and avoid the risks and hazards associated with the congestion that arises sometimes with forklift traffic and pedestrian activity within warehouses. Well-designed areas around loading docks where goods enter and leave facilities in particular are areas where easy access, logical traffic flow, and high levels in safety can make a tremendous difference and a contribution to speed, efficiency, and quality. By way of a rule of thumb, if you want one, the open areas of receipt and dispatch at the loading docks of a typical warehouse should, depending on the nature of the operation, occupy about 20 to 30% of the footprint of the warehouse. Less than this, you start to run the risk of that area becoming pretty quickly a bottleneck. On the storage equipment front, even if we just focus on pallet storage systems, there are so many different equipment types that they can present a bewildering array to choose from. Each option provides different density of storage within a given space, and the choice of the equipment should not depend just on the amount of inventory that you have to store and the size of the facility, but rather on the dynamic throughput characteristics of the stock itself. For example, The portion of the stock profile in which batch sizes oscillate, say, between 1 and 10 pallets, is ideally suited to bog standard pallet racking, because normally you will require single access to individual pallets at specific points in time. As batch sizes then increase, when you get above 10 pallets per batch, only then can you really start thinking about denser storage systems like pushback racks and gravity flow racks and other more sophisticated systems where you can store pallets 3, 4, 5 and more pallets deep. The general rule of thumb with these systems is that the batch size needs to be an average of 3 to 4 times the depth of the storage system. So, for example, if you have a pushback racking system of 3 pallets deep, really your minimum batch sizes in that system should be in and around 9 to 12 pallets and bigger. If it's 4 deep, 12 to 16 and bigger, and so on and so forth. If these rules of thumb are not followed, what will happen is you will get into very poor space utilization and many other undesired effects will arise. In terms of stock deployment within the warehouse, and here I'm not talking about inventory management, which is a much wider supply chain topic that impacts on business continuity and working capital, but rather with the stock that is actually in the warehouse, how can I access it quickly and efficiently when I need to, while at the same time minimizing travel distances, reducing physical effort, and the number of times that we actually handle the product. In any real-life stock profile, at one end there are going to be items that will be required very frequently in large volumes, and at the other end there are going to be items that are required in small volumes and very infrequently. This is an illustration of the well-known Pareto principle, or the 80-20 rule. So the challenge is, across that whole profile, how exactly do I provide ready access to all of these items in an effective and efficient manner? And a lack of attention to detail here can lead to tremendously time-consuming, physically demanding and inefficient ways of working in the warehouse when trying to retrieve materials, whether it be for factory orders or for customer orders. So in many of the best facilities that we see, the true consumption profile of each material is actually determined, both in terms of its quantity and its volumetric throughput. What is done then is, on the lower levels of the storage systems, dedicated pick faces are created to hold a reasonable day's amount of throughput for that particular stock item. And that will vary. So for those high volume movers, that may be several pallets worth of stock on the pick face. For others, it may be just a few cases. And for others, it may be just single items in a partitioned tote box. So these pick locations then are replenished as required from overstocks of the same items or batches located at the higher levels in the warehouse. And these pick locations then will vary in design themselves. Some will be pallet locations, some will be decked shelf levels inserted into pallet racking, others will be small shelving systems or even cabinets, drawers or carousels. So the balance that's being struck here is the balance between the gain in productivity from being able to access all of the different items from the ground using simple equipment over reduced travel distances, as opposed to the replenishment, the trade-off in the replenishment that it takes to restock those pick faces as needed. Obviously, the bigger the pick face, the less frequently you're going to have to replenish. And the smaller the pick face, the more frequently you're going to have to replenish. But that said, benchmark statistics tell us that between 60-70% of all warehouse activities, labor effort, is consumed in accessing material, retrieving material from stock. And about 60-70% of that time is spent in traveling from location to location, adding no value. So therefore, strategies that can help to reduce that travel time in picking will have immense positive impacts in terms of productivity and access to the required stock. I've been involved in projects where these types of changes are yielding 20 to 30% productivity improvement with simple reconfiguration and minimal, if any, capital investment. In terms of labour standards within warehouses, we'll take a quick look at labour standards in production management. In my introduction, I mentioned how cycle times and the distances travelled in warehouses make operations difficult to monitor, difficult to manage, and difficult to control. In warehouses where the layout is poor, the stock deployment is unscientific. The processes will be rarely fully standardized enough, and there'll be lots of variability. And therefore, it doesn't really make sense to develop a standard. And it's almost impossible to plan resources against a volume of work that's coming down the tracks. On the other hand, then, in those operations where those higher end operations, where the major structural elements of layout, storage, handling equipment, stock deployment have been effectively dealt with, and the warehouse truly supports efficient flow and well-structured processes, it becomes possible to establish standards for the various elements of work that are carried out within the warehouse operations. To be most effective, these standards need to be developed with the active participation of the associates that actually work in the warehouse. The standards then become a means to establish recognized levels of performance, to provide focus, incentive, and comparability between different parts of the operation or between different operations in the same organization. In some organizations, they opt to develop these standards on the basis of consensus estimation and negotiation. Others on the basis of analysis of the historical data from their movements transactions in their warehouse management systems or their ERP systems. And others on the basis of benchmarked or fully engineered standards with direct measurement of the work. Once these standards then have been deployed and implemented, they can be very powerful in contributing to all the aspects of operational improvement, including resource utilization planning, the training and development of new hires, and also pinpointing where processes may be breaking down. So they can be very powerful drivers of continuous improvement and the prioritizing of retraining among the team. In conjunction with modern labour management systems to which the standards can be introduced, they can provide real-time monitoring and visibility into the progress of work as it actually happens in the warehouse. And this is something that has been very elusive heretofore in warehouse operations. So these are just three of the many day-to-day aspects of warehouse operations where the best-in-class companies are applying more focus, more structure, and more science to development of excellence in their warehouse operations. At the higher level then, coming back up, overlaid on top of this, of these very basic elements, we have a number of overarching trends that are coming to the fore. And they're exerting their influence to transform warehouse operations into sophisticated, digitally integrated locations where people with high-level skills and knowledge are working that enable them to contribute positively to their business goals. And I'll touch very quickly on just three of these. The first one is the digital integration of the warehouse itself into the wider business and into the supply chain. So high functionality warehouse management systems integrated into wider enterprise systems are now becoming more common in many organizations. When implemented appropriately, they can deliver benefits that are going to underpin and enhance the returns from the good design, the effective stock deployment, and the standard work that we spoke about earlier. Further integrated with labour management systems, barcode scanning, they're converting warehouses into digitally integrated high-tech work environments. The next area, trends that we're seeing is collaboration with outside experts. So despite all the developments and improvements that we've spoken about, it's still true that for many manufacturing businesses, warehousing is not a core competence, and it never will be. Space is at a premium, and investment capital, rather than being invested in warehouse capacity, will tend to go towards increasing manufacturing capability. So we're seeing many hybrid models develop where outside service providers are holding a greater part of the inventory required to sustain the manufacturing business and support in-stock supermarkets and Kanbans. A third area is the use of digital media training for the delivery of training straight into the workplace. So in order to avoid the extraction of associates from the work environment, the use of digital media training modules sitting on digital learning management platforms and delivered through mobile devices is becoming the way of the future. So these are just some of the trends impacting warehouse operations in manufacturing today and into the future for you to consider and to ponder. So to conclude then, I'd just like to say that while I recognize that the warehouse may never become the princess to the manufacturing Prince Charming, I'm pretty sure that she certainly cannot continue to be the Cinderella of this particular story. Thank you.